This presentation, we are learning about the completing square method. This is relevant for Cambridge Additional Mathematics O-Level students and also Pure Mathematics 1 ACE level students. Completing the square of x squared plus 8x. So can you see I have highlighted 8 over here. The first step is we pick this 8, we divide it by 2, so the answer is 4, and we square it and write, that is 16. How do we complete the square? X squared plus 8x plus 16. We also can write this as a perfect square, that is x plus 4 whole thing squared. What do? You bring this x and you join this 4. So we have x plus 4 whole thing squared. X plus 4 whole thing squared. Please look at this. The square is outside over here. In other words, when you expand this x plus 4 whole thing squared, you will get the x squared plus 8x plus 16. X squared plus 14x. So what do? We pick 14. We divide it by 2, that is 7. Nextly, we square the answer 7, that is 49. So using the completing square method, we can complete the expression as x squared plus 14x plus 49. We can write this as a perfect square, that is x plus 7 whole thing squared. So how do we write this as a perfect square? We have x and we also have 7 here. That is a square of this last term, which is 49. So we have x plus 7 and its whole thing squared. X plus 7 whole thing squared. Actually, the middle term you omit, because when you expand the perfect square x plus 7 whole thing squared, you will get it as x squared plus 14x plus 49. Next example, x squared minus 6x. As we did before, we pick the middle term, which is minus 6. We divide it by 2, that is minus 3. And when we square minus 3, it becomes plus 9. So we can complete the expression as x squared minus 6x plus 9. We can write this as a perfect square, that is x minus 3 whole thing squared. How do we write it? We have x from here, that is x squared. And here it is minus 3 squared. So x and minus 3, we join it together, x minus 3 whole thing squared. X squared plus 6x plus 9. So we are going to use completing square method to write this given expression as a perfect square. So as usual, we take the coefficient of the x term, which is 6. We divide it by 2 and then we square it and write. But this is little different from the previous examples that you did, because in the previous examples you had only 2 terms. Now in this case, you have 3 terms. So but you have to follow the same steps that you did. What do? You write x squared plus 6x and then this which I have highlighted in green, this 3 squared is what you found from this. You write 3 squared next. And this plus 9 is there in the given sum. Since you added this 3 squared, which is 9, you subtract that from the expression because there is a null effect from this 3 squared which you add and also the 3 squared which you subtract. It does not harm the original expression. And then when you are doing this kind of a sum, you join the first 3 terms together and the next 2 terms together. So here I join the first 3 terms together. What I do, I write this as a perfect square x plus 3 whole thing squared, as we did in the previous example. Thereafter, I will simplify this plus 9 minus 3 squared. So, plus 9 minus 3 squared is again it's 9. So, 9 minus 9, it is 0. How I simplify such an expression is, I first simplify the first 3 terms together. Then I simplify the next 2 terms together. So, perfect square is x plus 3 whole thing squared. This example, x squared plus 8x plus 9. So, we pick 8 divided by 2, that is 4, and we square it. So, when we write it, I'm not going to write it as 16, I will just write it as 4 squared. So, x squared plus 8x plus 4 squared. So, I have written it in green, that is 4 squared. Plus 9 is there in the sum. And then again, minus 4 squared. So, these green highlighted terms will cancel off as 0. So, there is no harm to the original expression x squared plus 8x plus 9. Thereafter, we link the first 3 terms together and we also simplify the next 2 terms together. So, here I group the first 3 terms and I write it as x plus 4 whole thing squared as we did in the previous sum. So, here I will write x, I omit the middle term, plus 4 whole thing squared. So, you can see this squared goes out over here. And then I simplify the next 2 terms, that is 9 minus 16. 9 minus 16 is minus 7. So, this is how you use the completing square method. And you can write it as a perfect square, x plus 4 whole thing squared minus 7. Look at this example. It's x squared minus 12x plus 5. So, we are going to use completing square method. We pick minus 12. We divide it by 2. That is minus 6. And we square minus 6, that is plus 36. But when we write it to the expression, which I have highlighted in green, we just write it as minus 6 squared because it's easy for you to simplify. So, it's x squared minus 12x plus, this is minus 6 squared, I write it here in green, plus 5 is there in the sum. Because I add a minus 6 squared, I will also subtract the minus 6 squared. Now, I will simplify the first 3 terms together, then the next 2 terms. So, here I group the first 3 terms. I will write it as x minus 6 whole thing squared. Look at this, x minus 6 whole thing squared. So, for all this time, we had been omitting the middle term when we write it as this perfect square part. And then the next 2 terms, that is plus 5, subtract, minus 6 squared is plus 36. So, from 5, when you subtract 36, that is minus 31. So, the perfect square of x squared minus 12x plus 5 Using the completing square method, we can write it as x minus 6 whole thing squared minus 31. This is an exercise for you. So you try doing these questions of your own. And I will give you the answers only. You follow the same method, which is the completing square method. And you get your answers and check whether you're getting these answers. So here the answers are given. Please check whether you're getting the answers. Okay, so 2x squared minus 4x plus 5. When we are using completing square method in this expression, the first step is you have to bring the factor of 2 out of the expression. Why? The 2 is the coefficient of this x squared term. So you bring this 2 out of the expression as a factor and then you write it as 2 brackets x squared minus 2x plus 5 over 2. Thereafter, you will follow the same steps of completing square method for this particular expression that is inside this bracket. You take minus 2, that's I have written it over here. You divide it by 2, that is minus 1, and you square it and write. So, you write the 2 as it is. You open a bracket, x squared minus 2x. You're going to add this term over here, that is minus 1 whole thing squared, and then add 5 over 2, that is there in the expression. Since you add this minus 1 whole thing squared, you also have to subtract minus 1 whole thing squared and you close the bracket. Thereafter, you simplify the first 3 terms together and the next 2 terms next. So as you know, when we simplify the first 3 terms, we omit the middle term. We join x minus 1 whole thing squared. So here you can see I have written 2 as it is and I have joined the first 3 terms and have written x minus 1 whole thing squared plus, and the next 2 terms I have rewrite here. So we are going to simplify this in the next step. So that is 2 x minus 1 whole thing squared plus 5 over 2. Here subtract. You know minus 1 squared is plus 1. So when you subtract 1 from 5 over 2, your answer is 3 over 2. So the final answer you can remove the bracket and write as 2 times x minus whole thing squared plus 2 times 3 over 2. Look at this, I am removing the curly brackets. So when I remove the curly brackets, 2 times x minus 1 whole thing squared plus 2 times 3 over 2 means 2 and 2 will cancel off and you have 3 here. So your final answer is 2 x minus 1 whole thing squared plus 3. 2x squared minus 2x plus 3. When we are using completing square, first step is you have to take the factor 2 out from the expression. So it's 2, you open brackets, x squared minus x plus 3 over 2. Thereafter, we follow the same steps for this x squared minus x plus 3 over 2. What do? You pick the coefficient of the middle term, which is minus 1. You divide it by 2. You square the whole thing. So your answer is 1 over 4. Here we write it 2 open bracket x squared minus x. Here you are going to add this extra term, that is minus 1 over 2 whole thing squared, that is this term, and then add 3 over 2, that is there in the sum. Since you added this minus half squared, you have to subtract minus half squared. So we close the bracket. Then we simplify the first 3 terms together, next 2 terms together. So our answer is 2. You join the first term and the last third term, that is x minus half whole thing squared. We omit the middle term and simplify 3 over 2, subtract minus half squared. When you simplify minus half squared, that is 1 over 4. So when you subtract 1 over 4 from 3 over 2, your answer is 5 over 4. Now we remove the curl bracket. 2 times x minus half whole thing squared plus 2 times 5 over 4. So you know 2 times 5 over 4 is 2 times 1, 2 times 2. So it becomes 5 over 2. So your answer is 2 x minus half whole thing squared plus 5 over 2. Next example, 2x squared minus 3x plus 5. So first step, you bring the factor 2, which is the coefficient of x squared, out of the expression, and you write it as 2 x squared minus 3 over 2x plus 5 over 2, and then you follow the same steps under completing square method for this expression that is inside the bracket. So you pick minus 3 over 2 and you divide it by 2. So you know when you divide minus 3 over 2 by 2, you multiply minus 3 over 2 by half. Minus 3 over 2 times half means minus 3 over 4. And you square it. So your answer is 2 x squared minus 3 over 2x. So this is the term that you simplified over here. Minus 3 over 4 whole thing squared plus 5 over 2, that is this. Since you add this extra term, we are going to subtract the same term. So now our answer is 2 x squared minus 3 over 2x plus minus 3 over 4 whole thing squared plus 5 over 2 minus 3 over 4 whole thing squared. We close the bracket. And we know we simplify the first 3 terms together and the next 2 terms together. So when we simplify the first 3 terms together, we write 2 as it is. Then we pick x minus 3 over 4 whole thing squared, because we omit the middle term. And the next 2 terms, I will simplify it in the next step and show you. So that is 9 over 16 over here. We have simplified separately. From plus 5 to when you subtract 9 over 16, it is 31 over 16. Now we remove the curl bracket. So that is 2x minus 3 over 4 whole thing squared. You remove the curl bracket. From 2 multiply this term. And from 2 you multiply 31 over 16. So 2 times 1 and 2 times 8. This is an exercise for you. I have not done the workings, but I have given the answers for you. So you work it out and check your answers. When you are doing the first sum, I'll give you a hint. You have to bring the factor 2 out from the expression. And it will become x squared minus 3 over 2 plus 6. You have to use the completing square method for the expression that is inside the bracket. In this sum, you have to bring the factor 3 out of the expression because 3 is the coefficient of x squared. Then it is x squared minus 1 over 3x plus 2 within the bracket. In this question also, you have to bring the factor 3 out of the expression, and within brackets you have x squared minus 4x plus 5 over 3. So please be careful when you are simplifying the fractions. I have not shown the workings for these questions, but the answers are given. Please check the answers after you do the questions of your own. We will continue with our next presentation. Please keep the channel subscribed so you will get the updates.